August 31, 1943. Dawn broke over the USS Yorktown, its steel deck pitching gently in the Pacific swell 200 miles east of Marcus Island. In the ready room below, Ensign Robert Duncan sat with his hands folded, listening to the briefing officer describe their target. The words washed over him. His mind was elsewhere, fixed on a single thought that had consumed him since he first climbed into the cockpit of his new fighter 3 weeks earlier. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The aircraft waiting on deck was nothing like the Wildcat he had trained in. Where the Wildcat felt nimble and responsive, almost delicate in its construction, this new Grumman fighter felt brutish and powerful. The F6F Hellcat. 15,000 pounds of aluminum and steel wrapped around the most powerful radial engine Pratt & Whitney had ever mass-produced. 2,000 horsepower channeled through an 18-cylinder double Wasp that shook the entire airframe when you pushed the throttle forward. But what haunted Duncan, what kept him awake in his bunk at night, was something the test pilots had mentioned during checkout training at Patuxent River. Something that contradicted everything Japanese pilots had learned about American carrier fighters during 2 years of war. The Hellcat could climb, not just adequately, but exceptionally, over 3,000 feet per minute at combat power. Fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, and a belly tank, the Hellcat would ascend like it was being pulled skyward by an invisible hand. Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to certain realities when engaging American fighters. The Wildcat was tough, heavily armored, difficult to destroy, but it was slow to climb, sluggish in vertical maneuvers. A Zero pilot with altitude advantage could dictate the terms of engagement, diving on the Wildcat at will, then climbing away before defensive fire became effective. This tactical reality had saved countless Japanese pilots from destruction during the brutal fighting over Guadalcanal and the Solomons. What they did not know, what they could not yet comprehend, was that those rules had just changed. Fighting Squadron 5 began launching at 0600 hours. 12 Hellcats, fresh from Grumman's Bethpage plant, painted in the early war scheme of blue-grey over light grey. Duncan's aircraft was Bureau number 04940, one of the first production F6F 3 seconds delivered to operational squadrons. He strapped in, ran through the checklist, felt the massive engine catch and roar to life with a violence that made his teeth chatter. The catapult officer signalled. Duncan pushed the throttle to maximum power, felt the Hellcat shudder against the holdback, then surge forward as the catapult fired. 3 seconds later he was airborne, climbing at a rate that still astonished him despite weeks of training flights. 2,500 feet per minute at sea level with full combat load. By the time he reached 8,000 feet, the climb rate had barely degraded. The massive Pratt & Whitney engine, force-fed by its supercharger, continued delivering full power as altitude increased. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The formation assembled and turned northwest toward Marcus Island. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, empty blue interrupted only by scattered clouds. The morning sun lit the water in shades of turquoise and deep azure. Duncan's division leader, Lieutenant Commander Charles Crommelin, led them higher. 10,000 feet, 12,000. 15,000. The Hellcats climbed steadily, easily, without the struggling and gasping that characterized Wildcat climbs at these altitudes. At 18,000 feet, Crommelin leveled off, and the formation spread into combat spacing. Below and ahead, Marcus Island appeared as a small grey smudge on the horizon. Intelligence reported at least 20 Japanese fighters based there, a mix of Zeros and newer models. The strike bombers would be hitting the airfield in 20 minutes. The Hellcat's job was to sweep ahead, engage any Japanese fighters attempting to intercept, and clear the sky for the attack. Duncan checked his instruments. Engine temperature normal. Oil pressure steady. Fuel sufficient for 2 hours of combat operations. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns in his wings held 400 rounds each, 2,400 rounds total. Enough firepower to destroy multiple enemy aircraft if his aim was true. What was about to happen over Marcus Island would not immediately change the course of the war. This was a relatively minor raid, a probe against a secondary target. But for the Japanese pilots who would encounter the Hellcat for the first time, the engagement would shatter assumptions that had governed Pacific air combat since December of 1941. And the lessons learned in those few minutes of combat would ripple forward through the remaining 2 years of the Pacific War, fundamentally altering the balance of aerial power. To understand why the Hellcat represented such a revolutionary development and why its climb performance in particular proved so devastating to Japanese tactical doctrine, requires understanding the aircraft's origins and the specific engineering decisions that made it what it was. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had been designing fighters for the United States Navy since the early 1930s. Founded by Leroy Grumman and his partners in 1929, the company had built its reputation on rugged, reliable aircraft that could withstand the punishment of carrier operations. Their F6F Wildcat, introduced in 1940, embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was tough, well-armed, and capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. But by early 1942, Navy leadership recognized that toughness alone was not sufficient. Combat reports from the Pacific painted a clear picture. The Japanese Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighter, outperformed the Wildcat in speed, maneuverability, and critically, in rate of climb below 14,000 feet, while American pilots were learning tactics to compensate for these disadvantages. The fundamental performance gap meant that too many young aviators were dying in aircraft that simply could not match their opponents' capabilities. On April 22, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, already famous for his Medal of Honor action defending the carrier Lexington, visited Grumman's plant on Long Island. O'Hare had extensive combat experience against the Zero and spent hours with Grumman engineers, explaining in detail what Navy pilots needed to survive and win in the Pacific. The day before, President Roosevelt had asked O'Hare what was needed in a new naval fighter. O'Hare's response was immediate and specific. Something that will go upstairs faster. Climb performance. The ability to gain altitude quickly, to reach advantageous positions before the enemy, to escape dangerous situations by climbing away. This single requirement would drive much of the Hellcat's design philosophy, but O'Hare's input came after the Hellcat program was already well underway. Work had begun in mid-1941 on Grumman's G50 design, which received the military designation F6F. The initial concept was straightforward: create a larger, more powerful version of the Wildcat, clean up the aerodynamics, add a bigger engine, increase fuel capacity and firepower, but maintain the basic design philosophy that made the Wildcat successful. The prototype contract was signed on June 30, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. At that point, American intelligence about Japanese fighter capabilities was limited. The Zero was known to be formidable, but its full performance envelope remained unclear. Grumman's initial design specified the Wright R2600 twin cyclone engine, a 14-cylinder radial producing 1,700 horsepower. This would have given the new fighter substantial improvement over the Wildcat's 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine. Then came December 7, 1941, and America's entry into the war. Combat reports from the Philippines, Wake Island, and Pearl Harbor revealed the Zero's true capabilities. The aircraft was faster, more agile, and better climbing than anything American forces could field. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages ruthlessly, achieving kill ratios that approached 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 in the war's early months. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics recognized immediately that 1,700 horsepower would not be sufficient. On April 26, 1942, just 4 days after O'Hare's visit to Grumman, Boer directed the company to install the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp engine in the second F6F prototype. This engine, already powering the Vought F4U Corsair and the Army's P-47 Thunderbolt, produced 2,000 horsepower at sea level. It was the most powerful radial engine in American production, and it would transform the Hellcat from a good fighter into a great one. The R-2800 was a masterpiece of American engineering. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9, displacing 2,800 cubic inches. The engine generated its power through sophisticated metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and advanced supercharging. The 2-stage supercharger system, driven by engine power rather than exhaust gases, compressed incoming air to maintain sea-level pressure at altitude. This meant the engine could produce maximum rated power all the way up to its critical altitude of 19,000 feet. But power alone was not enough. The engine had to be integrated into an airframe that could use that power effectively. Grumman's engineers redesigned the F6F to accommodate the larger, heavier R-2800. The fuselage was widened and strengthened. The wings were enlarged to 42 feet 10 inches in span, giving the aircraft sufficient lifting area to handle combat weights approaching 15,000 pounds. The wing design incorporated lessons from Wildcat operations. The outer panels folded for carrier stowage. The structure was massively strong to handle arrested landings, and the entire assembly was designed for ease of maintenance and battle damage repair. The propeller deserved special attention. A 13-foot diameter Hamilton Standard constant speed unit, it absorbed the R-2800's tremendous power and converted it into thrust with remarkable efficiency. The propeller's automatic pitch control meant pilots could focus on flying and fighting without constantly adjusting blade angles. At high power settings, the propeller tips approached sonic velocity, creating the distinctive roar that announced the Hellcat's presence. The first F6F1 prototype, powered by the Wright R2600, flew on June 26, 1942. Performance was adequate but unspectacular. Maximum speed of 375 miles per hour at 17,000 feet. Rate of climb around 2,200 feet per minute at sea level. These numbers represented improvement over the Wildcat, but not the dramatic leap forward that Navy leadership demanded. 1 month later, on July 30, 1942, the second prototype took flight. This was the F6F3, equipped with the Pratt & Whitney R2800. The transformation was immediate and obvious. Maximum speed increased to 376 miles per hour at 23,400 feet. More importantly, rate of climb jumped to over 2,600 feet per minute at sea level and remained strong at altitude. The engine's power curve meant that climb performance actually improved as the aircraft gained altitude, peaking around 15,000 feet before gradually declining. Test pilots at Patuxent River pushed the prototype through its paces during late summer of 1942. They discovered something remarkable. The Hellcat, despite weighing nearly 15,000 pounds at combat load, could climb from sea level to 20,000 feet in just under 7.5 minutes. This was faster than the Zero could manage. The Japanese fighter's climb performance was exceptional below 14,000 feet, but above that altitude, its low-powered engine and lightweight construction became liabilities. The Hellcat, with its supercharged R2800 maintaining full power up to 19,000 feet, could outclimb the Zero at high altitude. The implications were profound. American pilots would no longer be at a disadvantage in vertical maneuvering. If a Zero attempted its classic tactic of diving on an American fighter, then climbing away to safety, the Hellcat pilot could follow the climb and maintain pursuit. If a Japanese fighter gained altitude advantage, the Hellcat could climb to equal or superior altitude before the enemy could capitalize on position. The tactical equation that had governed Pacific air combat for 18 months had just been rewritten. The first production, F6F3, flew on October 3, 1942. Just 16 months had passed since the prototype contract was signed. This extraordinarily rapid development cycle, from initial design to production aircraft, reflected both Grumman's engineering competence and the urgency of wartime requirements. The Navy needed fighters immediately. Every week of delay meant more pilots flying obsolescent Wildcats against superior Japanese aircraft. Grumman's Bethpage plant on Long Island ramped up production with impressive speed. By January 1943, the first operational aircraft were delivered to Fighting Squadron 9 for carrier qualification and tactical development. By February, VF-9 was aboard the USS Essex, conducting intensive training in preparation for combat deployment. By August, Fighting Squadron 5 on the USS Yorktown had received their Hellcats and was ready for the aircraft's combat debut. The production aircraft incorporated lessons from prototype testing and early fleet feedback. Armor protection was extensive. 212 pounds of steel plate shielded the cockpit, including a 69-pound armored headrest and quarter-inch plate behind the pilot's seat. Additional armor protected the oil tank and oil cooler beneath the engine. The windscreen incorporated bullet-resistant glass thick enough to stop machine gun rounds and small-caliber cannon shells. A 250-gallon self-sealing fuel tank in the fuselage used multiple layers of rubber compound that would swell when punctured, preventing catastrophic fuel loss from combat damage. Armament was formidable. 6 Browning A&M 250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. 2,400 rounds total, enough for approximately 30 seconds of continuous firing at the gun's cyclic rate of 800 rounds per minute each. In practice, pilots fired in short bursts of 1 to 3 seconds, making ammunition last for 15 to 20 separate engagements. The 50 caliber round, weighing approximately 1 3/4 ounces with armor-piercing incendiary characteristics, could penetrate aircraft aluminum structure, damage engines, rupture fuel tanks, and incapacitate pilots at ranges exceeding 600 yards. The guns were mounted well outboard in the wings, creating a convergence pattern that concentrated all 6 weapons' fire at a point between 200 and 400 yards from the aircraft, depending on how ground crews set the convergence. At this distance, even a brief burst delivered devastating firepower. A 2-second burst put approximately 260 rounds into a cone of destruction, roughly 10 feet in diameter. Few aircraft could survive such concentrated fire. Visibility from the cockpit was exceptional, a direct result of Lieutenant Commander Jackson's input after analyzing early combat reports. Jackson had emphasized to Grumman engineers that you can't hit them if you can't see them. The solution was to mount the cockpit high on the fuselage and slope the forward deck downward toward the engine, cowling. This gave Hellcat pilots excellent forward and downward visibility, critical for spotting enemy aircraft below and for carrier landing approaches. A rear-view mirror in the upper canopy allowed pilots to check their 6 o'clock position without contorting in the seat harness. The landing gear was hydraulically operated, a massive improvement over the Wildcat's hand-cranked system that required pilots to pump a handle 29 times to raise or lower the wheels. The Hellcat pilot simply moved a lever, and hydraulic pressure did the work. The main gear struts were exceptionally robust, designed to handle carrier-arrested landings at sink rates that would collapse lighter landing gear. Grumman engineers had studied Wildcat carrier landing accidents and reinforced every structural component that showed tendency to fail under stress. The wing fold mechanism was equally well engineered. The outer panels folded upward and back, reducing the aircraft's span from 42 feet 10 inches to just 16 feet 2 inches for hangar deck storage. Deck crews could fold or unfold the wings in seconds without requiring special equipment or excessive manpower. This stow-wing system, as Grumman called it, became a signature feature of their carrier aircraft designs. But all these features, important as they were, came back to the central question. How would the Hellcat perform in actual combat against experienced Japanese pilots flying Zeros? The theoretical specifications looked impressive. The test flights at Patuxent River had validated performance claims, but combat was different. Combat involved split-second decisions, violent maneuvering, the confusion of multiple aircraft swirling through three-dimensional space, the psychological pressure of watching tracers arc past your canopy while knowing that one direct hit could mean death. The answer to that question was about to be written over Marcus Island. At 06:45 hours, Duncan's radio crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock low, 8,000 feet, 6 aircraft climbing. Japanese fighters, identified as Zeros by their distinctive silhouette, were ascending from Marcus Island's airfield to intercept the incoming American formation. The Japanese pilots had likely spotted the Hellcats several minutes earlier and were climbing to gain altitude advantage before engaging. This was exactly the tactical situation that had proven so dangerous for Wildcat pilots. The Zero climbed exceptionally well below 15,000 feet. In previous engagements, Japanese pilots would spot American formations, begin climbing while still beyond gun range, and reach superior altitude before the slower climbing Wildcats could prevent it. From that position of advantage, the Zeros would dive on the Americans, attack with their 20mm cannon and 7.7mm machine guns, then climb away to safety before the Wildcats could effectively respond. The tactic worked because the Wildcat simply could not match the Zero's climb rate. Attempting to follow a Zero in a vertical climb was often suicidal, but the Hellcat was not a Wildcat. Cromelin's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "All aircraft, maintain Angels 18, we're staying high, let them come to us." This was new, tactical thinking, enabled by the Hellcat's capabilities. Instead of diving to meet the threat and surrendering altitude advantage, the American formation would maintain position and force the Japanese to climb into a disadvantageous engagement. The 6 Zeros continued climbing, 10,000 feet, 12,000, 14,000. Their climb rate began to decrease noticeably as altitude increased, and their engines lost power in the thinning air. The Nakajima Sakai engine powering the Zero produced only 950 horsepower at sea level and lacked sophisticated supercharging. Above 15,000 feet, power dropped dramatically. The Zero remained flyable and maneuverable at high altitude, but its performance margins narrowed considerably. At 16,000 feet, the Japanese formation's climb rate had slowed to less than 1,000 feet per minute. The pilots were pushing their aircraft hard, trading airspeed for altitude, trying desperately to reach a position where they could engage the American fighters on favorable terms. But they were fighting physics and engineering, and both were against them. Duncan watched the approaching Zeros through his gun sight. They were close enough now to see individual aircraft features. The distinctive long canopy, the fixed landing gear with their aerodynamic fairings. The Japanese fighters were straining upward, their noses high, airspeed bleeding away as they clawed for altitude. At 17,000 feet, 2,000 feet below the American formation, the Zeros' climb rate had degraded to perhaps 500 feet per minute. The Japanese pilots had to make a decision: continue climbing and risk arriving at the American formation's altitude with no airspeed, vulnerable and unable to maneuver effectively, or level off, build speed, and attempt a climbing attack from below, accepting that they would be engaging from an inferior position. They chose to continue climbing. It was the wrong choice. Cromelin waited until the Zeros reached 17,500 feet, still 500 feet below the 20 Hellcat formation and barely climbing. Then he gave the order: all flights, engage. Maintain altitude control. Don't chase them down. Duncan's division leader rolled inverted and pulled 4G to point his nose at the nearest Zero. Duncan followed, staying in formation, maintaining the wingman discipline that had been drilled into him during training. The Hellcat responded instantly to control inputs. Despite its 15,000-pound weight, the aircraft rolled crisply and pointed where the pilot directed. The Zero pilot saw the Americans diving on him and reacted as trained. He pushed his stick forward and dove away, trading altitude for speed, attempting to gain separation and then reverse the engagement. But Duncan's division leader anticipated the move and adjusted his dive angle, keeping the Zero centered in his gun sight. At 400 yards, the leader opened fire. 6 50 caliber machine guns converged their fire on the fleeing Zero. Tracers arced through the air, every fifth round visible, marking the stream of fire. Strikes appeared on the Zero's left wing and fuselage. Pieces of aluminum skin tore away and tumbled through the slipstream. The Japanese fighter shuddered, rolled right, then entered a spin. The leader ceased fire and began his pullout, using the dive's accumulated speed to zoom climb back toward the formation's original altitude. Duncan stayed with him, maintaining position, fighting the G-forces that compressed him into his seat. The Hellcat pulled out smoothly at 15,000 feet and continued climbing. Within 40 seconds of the initial dive, both aircraft had regained 17,000 feet. The entire attack cycle, from dive initiation to altitude recovery, had consumed less than 1 minute and barely 200 feet of altitude loss. This was the Hellcat's true revolution. Not just the ability to climb quickly from sea level, but the capacity to dive, attack, and then recover altitude before enemy fighters could, capitalize on the momentary vulnerability. The massive R2800 engine provided enough power to zoom climb efficiently, converting the kinetic energy of the dive into potential energy of altitude. American pilots could attack repeatedly from above, using their altitude advantage to dictate engagement terms, striking and climbing away before Japanese fighters could respond effectively. The remaining 5 Zeros attempted to engage, but the tactical situation was hopeless. The Japanese pilots were trapped at altitude with insufficient airspeed, facing American fighters that could dive on them at will. 2 more Zeros fell to the Hellcat's guns in the next 3 minutes. The survivors dove away toward Marcus Island, abandoning their attempt to intercept the American strike package. Duncan never fired his guns during that first engagement. He maintained wingman discipline, covering his leader, watching for threats from behind or above, doing his job. But he had witnessed something that would reshape his understanding of aerial combat. The Hellcat could fight vertically. It could climb with Zeros, outclimb them at altitude, dive on them, and recover altitude for repeated attacks. The performance advantage was not marginal, it was overwhelming. The strike bombers hit Marcus Island's airfield without opposition. The Hellcats had swept the sky clean. On the return flight to Yorktown, Duncan's division leader spoke over the radio, summarizing what they had just experienced. "Gentlemen, that aircraft changes everything. We just climbed away from a Zero." Think about what that means. What it meant would become clear over the following months, as more Hellcat squadrons entered combat. The aircraft's climb performance, combined with its speed, firepower, and durability, created a tactical package that Japanese pilots could not counter effectively. Every assumption that had governed Pacific air combat since 1941 was now obsolete. Over Tarawa on November 23 and 24, 1943, Hellcats engaged Japanese aircraft in large-scale combat for the first time. American pilots claimed 30 enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of 1 Hellcat. The 11 o'clock announcement from Japanese commanders that the new American fighter climbs like our Zero sent shockwaves through Imperial Navy aviation units. If the Americans had achieved parity in climb performance while maintaining superiority in speed, firepower, and armor protection, how could Japanese pilots compete? The answer, increasingly, was that they could not. Not consistently. Not in sustained operations against well-flown Hellcats employing proper tactics. Individual Japanese aces with superior skill could still achieve victories, but the average pilot flying an average Zero was outmatched by an average pilot flying an average Hellcat. The performance differential was simply too great. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 would demonstrate the full scope of the Hellcat's dominance. This massive carrier engagement, the largest of the Pacific War, pitted Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet against Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with approximately 430 aircraft. Mitcher had 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft, the majority of them F6F Hellcats. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Japanese search planes located the American fleet. Ozawa launched his aircraft in 4 massive waves, hoping to overwhelm the American defenses through sheer numbers. What followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, one of the most lopsided aerial victories in military history. American radar detected the first Japanese attack wave at approximately 1000 hours. Admiral Mitcher ordered all fighters airborne. Over 220 Hellcats climbed rapidly to intercept altitude, established defensive positions in layers from 10,000 to 25,000 feet, and waited for the approaching enemy aircraft. The Japanese formation consisted of 69 aircraft, a mix of Zeros, Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers, and Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers. The strike had launched from maximum range, requiring the aircraft to fly over 300 miles to reach the American fleet. This meant Japanese pilots arrived with limited fuel for combat maneuvering, already fatigued from the long overwater flight, psychologically strained by hours of anticipation. The Hellcats hit them 55 miles from the American carriers. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu, flying from the USS Lexington, led his division into a formation of Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, attempting to break through to attack the carriers. Vrasiu's combat report, written later that day, described what happened next in clinical detail. I dove from 22,000 feet on a group of approximately 40 Judy dive bombers in loose formation, selected the nearest aircraft and fired a short burst from 400 yards. Strikes observed on fuselage and left wing. Target aircraft rolled left and entered a steep dive trailing smoke. Selected second target, closed to 300 yards, fired 2-second burst. Target exploded. Selected third target. The report continued in the same factual tone, documenting 6 Japanese aircraft destroyed in 8 minutes of combat. Vrasiu expended only 360 rounds, an average of 60 rounds per kill, demonstrating remarkable marksmanship and fire discipline. But Vrasiu's achievement, though exceptional, was not unique that day. Throughout Task Force 58's defensive perimeter, Hellcat pilots engaged Japanese formations with devastating effectiveness. The American fighters used their climb performance to maintain altitude advantage, dove on Japanese aircraft in coordinated attacks, destroyed or scattered entire formations, then climbed back to altitude for repeated engagements. Japanese pilots attempting to fight back found themselves trapped in impossible situations. If they tried to climb to engage the Hellcats at altitude, the Americans simply climbed higher, maintaining superiority. If Japanese aircraft dove away to escape, the Hellcats followed, their superior speed and diving characteristics allowing pursuit to lower altitudes. When Japanese pilots attempted vertical maneuvers, hoping to exploit the Zero's agility, they discovered that the Hellcat could match or exceed their climb rate above 15,000 feet. Of the 69 aircraft in the first attack wave, only 27 survived to return to their carriers. The second wave fared even worse. The third and fourth waves achieved minimal results while suffering catastrophic losses. By the end of June 19th, Japanese carrier aviation had been effectively destroyed. Of the approximately 430 aircraft launched that day, fewer than 100 survived. American losses totaled 23 Hellcats shot down, most due to anti-aircraft fire from ships rather than aerial combat. The kill ratio approached 20-1. Perhaps more devastating than the aircraft losses was the attrition of experienced pilots. Japan's naval aviation training system, already strained by 2 years of combat casualties, could not replace skilled aviators at the rate they were being lost. New pilots reached operational units with minimal flight time, often less than 100 hours total, and sometimes as little as 50 hours. These inexperienced aviators had no chance against American pilots flying superior aircraft and employing tactics refined through months of combat experience. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats was profound. Post-war interviews with Japanese aviators reveal consistent themes. The American fighter was faster than anything they could fly. It was more heavily armed, with 6 machine guns compared to the Zero's 2 machine guns and 2 cannon. It was far more durable, capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy a Zero. But most disturbing was the realization that the Hellcat could climb with them, even outclimb them at fighting altitudes. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with 64 confirmed victories, later wrote about his first encounter with Hellcats over the Solomon Islands. "I saw them climbing toward us at a rate I had never seen from American fighters. My immediate thought was that these must be a different type, perhaps land-based interceptors. When I learned they were carrier fighters, fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, I understood that we faced a new reality. The Americans had created a fighter that matched or exceeded our capabilities in every category that mattered. The climb performance that so shocked Japanese pilots was not the result of a single engineering breakthrough, but rather the cumulative effect of multiple design decisions working in concert. The powerful R2800 engine provided the foundation. The efficient supercharger system maintained that power at altitude. The propeller converted engine power to thrust with minimal loss. The airframe was clean enough aerodynamically to not waste power overcoming excessive drag. The structural strength allowed pilots to use full power in steep climbs without fear of overstressing the aircraft. But perhaps most important was that Grumman had engineered these capabilities into a package that was reliable, maintainable, and could be mass-produced rapidly. By March of 1945, Grumman was completing one Hellcat approximately every hour around the clock. Workers at the Bethpage plant had refined production techniques to the point where an F6F could be assembled from major components in just one day. Quality control remained high despite the production pace. Hellcats arriving at operational squadrons required minimal modification or repair before entering combat service. This production capability meant that American carriers always had sufficient fighters. Aircraft lost in combat or operational accidents were replaced quickly. Pilots knew that if they had to ditch or crash land, another Hellcat would be waiting when they returned to the ship. This created a psychological advantage that complemented the aircraft's performance superiority. American pilots could be aggressive, could take calculated risks, because they flew in aircraft that could absorb punishment and could be replaced if lost. Japanese pilots, by contrast, operated under increasing scarcity. Each aircraft lost was increasingly difficult to replace. Manufacturing quality declined as Japan's industrial base came under systematic attack from American bombers. Aluminum shortages forced the use of inferior substitute materials. Skilled factory workers were conscripted for military service. By late 1944, newly produced Zeros often arrived at operational units requiring extensive maintenance work before they could be considered combat-ready. The Hellcat's dominance extended beyond pure fighter versus fighter combat. The aircraft proved remarkably versatile in other roles. As a fighter bomber, the F6F could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs on centerline and underwing racks. The later F6F5 variant could carry 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets under the wings, providing effective firepower against ground targets and shipping. During the Okinawa campaign in 1945, Hellcats flew thousands of close air support sorties, dropping bombs and firing rockets against Japanese defensive positions. Grateful infantrymen called them Angels of Okinawa for the critical support they provided during desperate ground fighting. The aircraft's ability to transition seamlessly between air superiority, strike, and close air support missions made it invaluable for carrier air groups conducting sustained operations. Hellcat night fighters equipped with radar proved equally successful. The F6F3 Newtons and F6F5 Newtons variants carried airborne intercept radar in a pod on the right wing. These aircraft hunted Japanese bombers attempting night attacks against American task forces. The combination of radar detection, the Hellcat's excellent handling characteristics at night, and heavy firepower created an effective defensive system. Several pilots achieved ace status flying Hellcat night fighters, a remarkable accomplishment given the difficulty of night aerial combat. By war's end, Hellcats had accounted for 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed, representing 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. 307 pilots achieved ace status, scoring 5 or more victories while flying Hellcats. This was more than any other American fighter type. The aircraft's 19-to-1 kill ratio, based on combat losses versus confirmed kills, remains one of the highest ever achieved by any fighter aircraft in any conflict. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories, scored all of his kills in Hellcats. He later wrote in his combat memoir, "The F6F was an outstanding fighter plane. It performed well, was easy to fly, and was a stable gun platform. But what I really remember most was that it was rugged and easy to maintain. You could push it hard, take battle damage, and it would bring you home." That reliability, combined with performance that matched or exceeded anything the Japanese could field, made it the perfect weapon for carrier warfare. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhorter III, the first Navy pilot to achieve ace status in the Hellcat, and the first carrier pilot to become a double ace with 10 victories, offered similar praise. The Hellcat whumped the Japanese. It could do everything their fighters could do, and do it better. When they tried to run, we caught them. When they tried to climb, we climbed with them. When they tried to fight, our armor and firepower gave us overwhelming advantage. There was simply no aspect of aerial combat where a properly flown Hellcat was at a disadvantage against a Zero. The story of Japanese pilots encountering the Hellcat's unexpected climb performance was ultimately a story about technological superiority, translating directly into tactical dominance. In aerial combat, performance margins matter enormously. A fighter that climbs 10% faster than its opponent gains a critical advantage in vertical maneuvering. A fighter that climbs 20% faster, as the Hellcat did at altitude compared to the Zero, achieves near total dominance in that dimension of combat. Japanese aviation engineers understood this reality. Reports captured after the war show that technical personnel recognized the Hellcat's superiority and recommended urgent development of new fighters to counter it. The Kawanishi N-1KJ George and the Mitsubishi J-2M Jack were attempts to create aircraft with performance comparable to the Hellcat. Both achieved some success, but neither could be produced in sufficient quantities to alter the strategic balance. By the time these newer Japanese fighters entered service in meaningful numbers, American numerical superiority was so overwhelming that individual aircraft performance became increasingly irrelevant. The final irony was that the Hellcat, for all its combat success, never received the recognition or popular acclaim awarded to more glamorous fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the Corsair. The F6F was straightforward, workmanlike, efficient. It did its job with minimal drama and maximum effectiveness. British test pilot Eric Winkle-Brown, who flew virtually every significant Allied and Axis aircraft during World War II, described the Grumman F6F Hellcat as a perfect example of skill and luck combining to produce exactly the right aircraft at the right moment. The Hellcat was designed to counter a specific threat, the legendary Japanese Zero fighter, and engineered to be producible, maintainable, and flyable by young pilots with limited experience. The aircraft's development represented a distinctly American approach to the Pacific War. From initial concept to operational deployment, the Hellcat program consumed less than 2 years, a timeline that seemed impossible to Japan, which struggled with resource shortages, production bottlenecks, and strategic bombing disruption during the same period. The United States possessed the industrial capacity, engineering expertise, and resource base to design, test, and mass-produce sophisticated weapons systems at unprecedented speed. The Hellcat embodied a design philosophy that prioritized practical effectiveness over theoretical perfection. Grumman's engineers deliberately avoided attempting to create the fastest, most maneuverable, or longest-ranged fighter. Instead, they created a fighter that was fast enough, maneuverable enough, and had sufficient range for carrier operations. More critically, they designed an aircraft that pilots could master quickly, that maintenance crews could service under primitive conditions, and that could absorb battle damage while completing missions. This pragmatic approach extended to every aspect of the aircraft. The landing gear was deliberately overbuilt, heavier than pure engineering calculations required, because Grumman understood that carrier landings were violent and unpredictable. The wing structure was similarly over-strengthened to handle extreme G-forces during combat maneuvers. The cockpit layout reflected extensive input from operational pilots, with every control positioned for intuitive access, critical instruments grouped logically, and even small details like adjustable rudder pedals and seat height, receiving careful attention. These accumulated details created an aircraft that pilots trusted completely. In combat, trust matters enormously. A pilot who doubts his aircraft's reliability will hesitate and make conservative decisions that reduce combat effectiveness. The Hellcat inspired absolute confidence, allowing pilots to fight aggressively and take calculated risks. The Hellcat's climb performance became a psychological weapon that fundamentally altered the Pacific Air War. Japanese pilots flying Zeros had relied since the war's beginning on one critical tactical advantage: superior climb performance. When engaged unfavorably, a Zero pilot could point his nose skyward and climb away to safety. This escape route had saved countless Japanese pilots during the first 2 years of the war. When Japanese pilots first encountered Hellcats, the experience was profoundly shocking. One Zero pilot, interrogated by U.S. Navy intelligence officers in September 1945, described his first encounter near Saipan with remarkable clarity. His 4-aircraft division was flying at 16,000 feet when they spotted American fighters above them at 20,000 feet. Following standard tactics, the Japanese pilots attempted to climb to equal altitude before the Americans could dive on them, a maneuver that had sometimes worked against the earlier Wildcat fighters. What happened next changed everything. As the Zero formation climbed past 17,000 feet, the pilot witnessed something he had never seen from a carrier fighter. The American aircraft were also climbing, actively ascending at a rate that appeared to exceed the Zero's own climb performance. He realized immediately that his unit faced something entirely new. If the American fighter could climb as well as the Zero while also being faster and more heavily armed, Japanese tactical advantages had disappeared. The thought was terrifying. The engagement lasted approximately 3 minutes. The division leader was shot down in the first 30 seconds. The wingman disappeared shortly after. The surviving pilot dove to sea level and fled at maximum speed back toward his carrier, focused solely on survival. When he later discussed the encounter with other pilots who had faced the new American fighter, they all reported similar experiences. An aircraft that climbed like nothing they had seen from a carrier fighter, was significantly faster than the Zero, extremely durable, and carried tremendous firepower with 6 heavy machine guns. The Hellcat's climb performance closed the one avenue of escape that Japanese pilots had relied upon throughout the war. A Zero pilot in trouble could no longer simply climb away to safety. The Hellcat could follow, maintain pursuit, and continue engagement until one aircraft was destroyed or forced to disengage through other means. This capability forced Japanese pilots into turning fights where the Hellcat's superior speed, firepower, and durability provided overwhelming advantages. Alternatively, it forced them into diving escapes, where the Hellcat's excellent diving characteristics allowed effective pursuit. Every tactical option available to Japanese pilots led to outcomes that favored American aircraft and pilots. Desperate attempts to counter the Hellcat led Japanese aviation units to adopt increasingly ineffective tactics. Some units began operating exclusively at low altitude, below 10,000 feet, where the Zero retained slight maneuverability advantages and where the Hellcat's climb performance advantage was least pronounced. However, low-altitude operations exposed Japanese aircraft to increasingly effective American anti-aircraft fire and made navigation and formation keeping more difficult over open ocean. Perhaps most telling were Japanese tactical directives issued in late 1944 and early 1945. These captured documents explicitly warned pilots against attempting to climb away from American fighters, particularly the Hellcat. The documents recommended diving to low altitude at maximum speed when engaged, then attempting to reach friendly territory at sea level. This represented complete abandonment of the vertical maneuvering that had been central to Japanese fighter tactics since the war's beginning. The statistical result was a 19-to-1 kill ratio that Hellcat squadrons achieved throughout their combat service. These figures were not propaganda but were based on careful comparison of American claims against Japanese loss records captured after the war. While variation existed between units and engagements, the overall pattern was undeniable. Hellcat squadrons consistently achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1, frequently exceeding 15-to-1, and sometimes approaching 20-to-1. Individual pilots achieved remarkable records. Commander David McCampbell shot down 34 enemy aircraft during the war, including 9 in a single mission on the 24th of October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Flying with his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, McCampbell engaged a formation of approximately 60 Japanese aircraft. Over 90 minutes, McCampbell destroyed 9 aircraft, while Rushing destroyed 6. Neither American pilot was hit despite being vastly outnumbered. McCampbell's after-action report noted they were greatly aided by the Hellcats' excellent climb performance, which allowed repeated attacks without loss of altitude advantage. That phrase captured the essence of Hellcat effectiveness. The aircraft could fight in 3 dimensions, diving to attack and climbing to recover repeatedly until ammunition was exhausted or fuel required return to the carrier. This sustainable combat capability meant that a single Hellcat could engage multiple enemy aircraft in sequence, destroying one, climbing away, selecting another target, and continuing the cycle until tactical objectives were achieved. The Hellcat's success extended beyond combat performance to operational reliability. The aircraft maintained operational readiness rates consistently exceeding 90%, meaning 9 out of every 10 aircraft were combat capable at any given time. This contrasted starkly with Japanese operational readiness, which degraded throughout the war until by 1945, fewer than half of Japanese aircraft were considered combat ready. Maintenance crews appreciated the Hellcat's practical design. The aircraft featured panels that opened easily, systems that could be accessed without extensive disassembly, and components replaceable quickly using basic tools. Battle damage could often be repaired by squadron maintenance personnel without requiring return to depot-level facilities, meaning heavily damaged aircraft could return to combat status within days rather than weeks. One maintenance chief described his experience. The systems were straightforward, the engineering was solid. When something broke, which was rare, we could usually fix it in a few hours. Simple meant reliable. Reliable meant more aircraft available for missions. More aircraft on missions meant more enemy aircraft destroyed. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation had been effectively destroyed as a strategic force. This wasn't an aberration, but the logical outcome of American pilots flying superior aircraft and employing tactics that exploited those advantages against opponents who lacked effective counters. By early 1945, Japanese defensive tactics had degraded to desperation measures. Kamikaze attacks represented explicit acknowledgement that conventional aerial combat was no longer viable. The fact that Japan's Naval Air Force, which had begun the war as perhaps the world's most capable carrier aviation force, was reduced to suicide tactics within 4 years demonstrated the completeness of their defeat. The Hellcat continued serving throughout the Pacific War's remainder, dominating every major engagement, supporting amphibious operations from Peleliu to Okinawa, striking targets on the Japanese home islands, and maintaining air superiority over the invasion fleet. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on the 15th of August 1945, Hellcats were flying combat air patrol over Tokyo Bay. For Japanese pilots who survived the war, the sound of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine remained forever associated with a specific moment, when they looked up and saw American fighters climbing toward them at unprecedented rates, realized their assumptions about American fighters were obsolete, and understood that their tactical advantages had evaporated. The Hellcats' climb performance had changed everything.